Overnight, silence turned into handcuffs. Burkina Faso's parliament didn't argue. It didn't split. It voted unanimously to criminalize homosexuality. Prison terms, fines, even deportation. But here's the contradiction. For decades, Burkina Faso was one of the rare places on the continent where the law stayed silent. No punishment, no statute, just an unusual kind of neutrality. Now that silence is over. And the question is bigger than morality. Is this really about protecting family values, or about something far louder, sovereignty dressed as law? Before we dive deeper, let me say this. If you're watching right now from the US, Africa, or anywhere in between, drop a comment below. Where are you tuning in from? And how does your community define freedom? Is it about personal choice, or about collective order? This is Africa Daily Good News, a channel where we connect breaking Africa news with global conversations, from Washington to Ouagadougou, from New York streets to Sahel villages. So if you want Africa's story told raw, bold, and unfiltered, hit that subscribe button and share this video so the debate isn't just headlines but human voices. And after all, when it comes to stories like this, the world isn't just watching Africa. Africa is watching back. Now, let's rewind the clock and see how Burkina Faso went from 60 years of silence to a unanimous vote that shook the continent. For more than 60 years, Burkina Faso lived with a strange paradox. A law book that said nothing while a society that spoke volumes. Unlike Nigeria or Uganda, where anti-LGBT statutes were carved into colonial codes, Ouagadougou's silence stood out like a blank page. On paper, same-sex relations weren't a crime. In reality, almost nobody dared to speak of them. Families treated it as taboo. Churches and mosques condemned it in private whispers, and yet the state looked the other way. That contradiction, silence without acceptance, shaped an entire generation. And here's the part that unsettles many observers. Silence itself became a kind of protection. If the government never named the act, the police never dragged people into court. Some Burkinabe quietly learned to live within that gap. In the same way Americans often assume that no news is good news. The absence of punishment was misread as tolerance. But was it really freedom or just a fragile truce? Think of a young man in Ouagadougou in the early 2000s. He never marched in a pride parade, never raised a flag, but he also never feared a judge's gavel. His life played out in shadows, dinners with friends, secret relationships, a cautious relief that at least the state wasn't hunting him. Then compare that to today, where the law suddenly calls him criminal. The shift is not just legal, it is psychological, tearing away the thin cover of neutrality that once gave space to breathe. However, history shows us that societies often prefer clarity over ambiguity. People, whether in America or Africa, tend to crave rules that define the boundaries, even if those rules feel harsh. When boundaries are vague, fear fills the silence. When boundaries are written, at least people know the lines they are crossing. That's the quiet logic behind why Burkina Faso's neutrality never felt secure, and why leaders finally moved to erase it. This change forces us to ask, what happens when silence that once protected is replaced by a voice that punishes? And if silence was never true freedom, what does this new chapter really represent? The answers begin to surface as we follow the country into its next turning point. Then, almost without warning, the silence cracked. In 2024, Burkina Faso's transitional government introduced a draft amendment, the first time in its history that homosexuality was written down as a crime. To outside observers, it looked sudden, but inside Africa, it felt more like a domino already tipping. Mali's junta had done it months earlier. Uganda stunned the world with one of the harshest anti-LGBT laws ever. Ghana debated its own bill. Nigeria continued enforcing bans. What once seemed like isolated moves now looked like a continental wave. And Burkina Faso, once neutral, was pulled straight into its current. This shift wasn't only about law, it was about identity. When a government chooses to write into its code what society has whispered for decades, it changes how people see themselves and their neighbors. Imagine the neighbor who once shook his head silently, now suddenly feels backed by parliament. His opinion is no longer just cultural, it carries the weight of the state. That alignment between private belief and public law creates a new kind of certainty, even if it brings fear for others. And here's the twist. Leaders framed the amendment not as importing something foreign, but as affirming what was already African. For many citizens, it was less about inventing morality and more about protecting what they believed was always theirs: culture, faith, community order. In the same way most Americans cling to the idea that family values should guide policy, even when definitions differ, Burkinabe leaders tied the law to protecting their own version of society's fabric. Still, questions linger. If silence lasted 60 years, why break it now? Was it purely domestic conviction or also a signal to the world that Burkina Faso was done playing by someone else's rulebook? When nations align their laws with their neighbors, is it because they agree or because they refuse to be left standing alone? These are questions with no easy answers, but they point to something deeper stirring across the Sahel. And before we move on, a quick reminder. If you want more of these raw Africa news updates that global outlets rarely tell this way, subscribe now to Africa Daily. Good news. Your support keeps these stories alive, and your comments help shape where we take them next. The vote in 2024 was only the draft. What came afterward would push the debate from Parliament's chamber into the streets, echoing through villages, mosques, and family tables, a drumbeat leading to a moment no one could ignore. By September 2025, the waiting ended with a thunderclap. Burkina Faso's parliament didn't just pass the bill, it voted unanimously to criminalize same-sex relations. The new law spelled out punishments: 2 to 5 years in prison, heavy fines, and deportation for foreigners. Overnight, what had once been tolerated in silence became punishable by the state, and the justice minister's words, describing homosexuality as bizarre behavior, weren't shocking to most citizens. They echoed the conversations already happening in living rooms, churches, and mosques across the country. This is where the story takes a sharper turn. For more than 60 years, people had lived under an invisible contract. Society disapproved, but the state didn't interfere. Now, that unwritten contract was torn up in public. Think of how people behave when rules shift. Like when a new law in the US suddenly bans something most people never thought twice about, whether it's flavored vapes or plastic straws. Overnight, what was once ignored becomes a target of enforcement. Human behavior changes, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes defiantly, but always noticeably. And here lies the hidden twist. The unanimous vote wasn't just about morality, it was about unity. In a transitional government, where politicians aren't elected by popular ballot, agreeing on one thing without dissent was powerful theater. It told citizens, we are united on culture, even if we are divided elsewhere. For a nation weary from insecurity and economic struggle, that kind of symbolic unity carries weight. It reassures people that their leaders, at least on moral issues, are speaking their language. But let's pause on the human side. Imagine a family in Bobo Dioulasso the night the law passed. The father hears the news on the radio, nods silently, and tells his teenage son that Burkina Faso has finally corrected itself. The son, who scrolls through global news on his phone, sees the international backlash and wonders whether his country is about to pay a heavy price. That generational split, the comfort of certainty for one, the anxiety of isolation for the other, captures the lived reality of such a decision. Still, this move raises a quiet question. When lawmakers and citizens walk in lockstep, is it always conviction, or can it also be convenience? In moments of crisis, governments often use moral legislation to rally people, deflect attention, and project control. Americans have seen versions of this too. Think of culture wars dominating headlines while infrastructure crumbles in the background. Human nature tends to seize on symbolic fights because they feel immediate, even if deeper problems remain unresolved. And so, as Burkina Faso stepped firmly into line with its neighbors, the applause at home was matched by murmurs abroad. The silence of yesterday was replaced by a law that shouted, and that voice would carry far beyond Ouagadougou's parliament walls, stirring debates about what sovereignty truly means in practice. The next chapter of this story would show just how costly that voice could become. Strangely, a law about private lives turned into a billboard for national power. In Burkina Faso, criminalizing homosexuality wasn't framed as an isolated morality issue. It was stitched directly into Captain Ibrahim Traoré's sovereignty project. This is the same leader who expelled French troops, tore up military agreements, and joined Mali and Niger in the Sahel alliance. Outlawing same-sex relations suddenly looked less like a cultural housekeeping measure and more like another chess move in his broader game, showing the world that Burkina Faso will write its own rules. And here's the sharp irony. For decades, global institutions told African states to modernize by adopting Western standards. Now, Burkina Faso signals modern independence by rejecting those very norms. It flips the script. Where the West sees regression, locals see defiance. That contradiction is powerful politics, and it speaks louder than any speech from a podium. Think about how people react to leaders who make bold breaks. In America, presidents often earn applause by promising to stand up to Washington insiders or drain the swamp. The specific policy almost matters less than the symbolism. In Ouagadougou, this law carried the same resonance. It told ordinary Burkinabe, your government is not bending to outsiders, it is echoing your faith, your culture, your sense of order. But there's a twist hidden inside that promise. When leaders lean on cultural laws to demonstrate sovereignty, they sometimes gain loyalty in the short term while sidestepping harder questions. A Burkinabe farmer struggling with rising grain prices may cheer the parliament's vote because it feels like dignity restored. Yet tomorrow, when his family still lacks electricity or safe roads, the question will return. How much of sovereignty is symbolism, and how much is delivery? Consider the story of a taxi driver in Ouagadougou I once heard about. The night of the vote, he praised Traoré's courage while driving passengers through streets darkened by power outages. He said, "At least my country is free." His words carried pride, but also revealed a deeper paradox. Sovereignty warms the heart, but it doesn't always light the street lamps. That human contradiction between emotional victory and material struggle is what gives this law its layered meaning. So while critics abroad may dismiss it as intolerance and supporters at home hail it as cultural protection, the reality is more complex. Burkina Faso's decision is both a moral stance and a sovereignty signal, designed to speak to different audiences at once. And that dual message, affirming culture while challenging global pressure, would soon bring the nation into a collision course with the outside world, one that could not be avoided. Here's the contradiction no one can ignore. The louder Burkina Faso asserts sovereignty, the harsher the echo from abroad. International lenders, rights groups, and Western governments didn't cheer the unanimous vote, they tightened their warnings. History shows what happens next. Uganda faced aid freezes. Ghana heard threats of sanctions. Nigeria wrestled with diplomatic isolation. Burkina Faso, already battered by insecurity and poverty, now risks stepping into the same storm. And this is where reality bites. A country that needs investment, food imports, and global partnerships now finds itself staring at potential penalties. The irony is heavy. The law meant to prove independence could deepen dependence if sanctions choke off support. Think about it. When a nation tries to stand tall but its economy gets squeezed, the people pay first. Families who already ration rice or struggle to afford fuel will feel the pressure long before politicians in parliament. Still, there's another side to this. Across Africa, leaders are preparing for that backlash by weaving new alliances. Traoré's Burkina Faso leans on neighbors like Mali and Niger, and on distant partners like Russia and China. This web of ties is meant to be a shield, offering loans, trade, and military cooperation without the Western strings attached. It's not just strategy, it's survival. For many citizens, it feels like a lifeline. Take the case of a shopkeeper in Ouagadougou who sells second-hand phones. Before the vote, he worried that foreign aid might keep shrinking. After the vote, he shrugged and said, "We'll trade with whoever respects us." His words capture a shift in psychology. When people feel the world is punishing them for their culture, they often double down on national pride instead of backing away. It's the same reflex you see in America when outside criticism only fuels stronger patriotism. Human beings, when cornered, cling to identity even more tightly. So the real twist is this. What outsiders see as reckless risk many inside Burkina Faso view as courage. And the question that lingers, how long can national pride carry a nation through the economic punches that might follow? That uncertainty is the weight hanging over every market stall and every family table. And it sets the stage for a larger conversation about how Africa's defiance reshapes not only its politics, but its survival in the modern world. Freedom itself has become the battlefield. In the West, freedom is measured by the individual, the right to choose, to speak, to live without interference. In Burkina Faso, and much of Africa today, freedom is framed around the collective, the duty to protect culture, faith, and community order. Both claim to defend liberty, yet their definitions collide like two trains on the same track. That collision is no longer abstract. It's written into law, and it's testing Africa's place in the world. What's striking is how ordinary people adapt when definitions shift. In America, debates over gun rights or abortion often split communities, yet each side insists it is fighting for freedom. The same pattern now unfolds in Ouagadougou, only the language has changed. A mother in the capital may say she feels freer knowing the law now defends her family's values, while a young man scrolling news on his phone fears his private life has been turned into a crime scene. Two people, one country, both convinced they are protecting freedom. And here comes the hidden twist. Laws like this don't only regulate behavior, they reshape identity. A society that once lived with silence now speaks with law. The collective voice grows louder, while the individual voice grows smaller. Whether that balance is sustainable will decide how this story unfolds. After all, if human beings can normalize almost anything over time, the question is, which version of normal will take root? A short story makes it real. Picture a student in Ouagadougou walking home from class. He remembers his uncle saying that Burkina Faso had once been different because it didn't copy colonial bans. Now, that difference is gone. The student wonders if one day he'll tell his own children the opposite story, that Burkina Faso became different again, not for silence, but for choosing sovereignty in the face of pressure. That generational handoff of meaning shows how quickly history can be rewritten by a single vote. So what does it all amount to? For Traoré's government, the law is another brick in the wall of sovereignty, a declaration that Africa will not be lectured on morality by Paris, Washington, or Brussels. For critics abroad, it's a step backward that risks economic punishment. And for ordinary Burkinabe, it's both. Pride wrapped in uncertainty, identity shadowed by hardship. The mood has shifted from silence to certainty, from neutrality to confrontation. And whether the world agrees or not, Burkina Faso has spoken in its own voice. That voice is not just about sexuality, it is about sovereignty, culture, and the right to decide who defines freedom. And it leaves us with a final, lingering question. When a nation insists on writing its own script, will the world listen, or will it punish the act of independence itself? In the end, Burkina Faso's vote wasn't just about law. It was about power, identity, and the refusal to be told what freedom must look like. One parliament, one decision, and the silence of 60 years was shattered. Whether you see it as cultural defense or national isolation, the message is clear. Africa is no longer whispering. It's speaking loudly on its own terms. And now it's your turn. Do you believe a nation has the right to define its own moral compass, even when the world disagrees? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If you found value in this story, make sure to subscribe to Africa Daily. Good news. Hit the like button and share this video so more people can join the conversation. Your support keeps these voices alive. And don't stop here. The next video on this channel dives even deeper into Africa's sovereignty battles, the kind of story global outlets rarely touch. Stay with us, click over, and keep the journey going.